Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. My name is Paul and I do videos about Japan, society, life and culture from the viewpoint of a long-term resident. I've been here about 18 years and I sometimes do some videos about hobbies of mine. Today is one such video and I'm going to talk about my hobby of Japanese woodblock prints or ukiyo-e. I've done a couple of videos about this before, including one that showed off most of my collection. But today I'm going to give you some basic tips as to how to judge the condition of a particular print. Now, this is not to say you're going to be able to judge the value of a particular print per se, because a really well-known famous print that is sought after but is in bad condition could very well be worth a lot more money than a really pristine print that no one really is interested in, and so those prices can be very different. But if you think about it in terms of you have two of the same print and you're trying to compare the condition between the two, what are some of the things you're going to be looking for? That's what I will be talking about today. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, first of all, we can certainly talk about the obvious things that you will see when you look at any kind of print. Are there creases in the paper? Are there tears? Are there visible holes? Those sorts of things, big stains on the paper, etc. Obviously, those things are going to affect the value. But there are a number of things that will be less apparent that you should check for. For example, if you have a print that's like in a nice frame or is backed or something, you may not be able to tell without actually taking it out and holding it up to the light whether it has pinholes or not. Because very often back in the day people took woodblock prints and they tacked them onto some kind of surface, onto a screen, onto a package, onto a variety of things it could have been tacked to, and those pinholes are left behind. So when you hold it up to the light, are there any pinhole light sources where the light is coming through? That's one thing. Next is, does the print have margins or not? A lot of prints were like they were tacked to things, they were also trimmed down. So people would take the print and they would trim off these outer white margins. And so a print that has that margin is going to be more valuable than a print that does not have that margin. Sometimes the margins can be a little uneven. This example here, it may have been trimmed on some parts, but actually it's usually the case where one or two parts of the margin will be wider than others, so that doesn't necessarily mean it's been trimmed. And especially in the Meiji era, at least, Meiji era prints would often have information written in the margins of some sort, including the date that it was made. A next detail that you would again have to take the print out and take a look at it outside of a frame is, does the print have any kind of backing or not? Now, if this was hanging on a wall, you wouldn't be able to tell, but you turn it around and some other paper, some other basically even writing, etc., can be found on the backs of prints. You can tell that another sheet or a couple of sheets of paper have been added to this print so that it has a backing. Sometimes that's done to reinforce the print, and sometimes it's just done, back in the day when these weren't valuable or collector's items, people just would add a backing to it and slap it on a wall or something. And as a result, as you can imagine, a backing makes a print a little less valuable than if it was just the original paper. The other two types of paper damage that you kind of have to take a close look at the print to see if they're there or not are called foxing and wormage. Now, I have examples of both in my print collection because they are relatively common. I don't have a lot of wormage examples. Wormage is where actual insect damage has happened. The way the print was stored, if it was in an attic or in a box in a corner, forgotten, and bugs got in there and were eating the paper, you end up with a pretty recognizable pattern. It definitely has a look that you'll recognize and understand to be insect damage. And sometimes the worm image can be like right smack dab in the middle of the page, and of course then the print is going to be less desirable. Next to this one, the print I used as an example earlier for margins, you can see foxing on this particular paper. Foxing is basically brown stains. Usually it's from the humidity. It's basically a kind of mildew or what they say called kabi in Japanese, which is like a mildew or fungus. Basically organic growth on the paper has discolored it somewhat, and that's why you want to keep your prints in some kind of cool, dry environment so that they don't attract insects or attract mildew. Color fading is also an issue. Basically, you should never display your prints for any length of time directly exposed to sunlight or outside light, because it's going to fade. It doesn't matter if it's Meiji or Edo or even 20th century. If you put it directly in the sun, it's going to fade. So the vibrancy of the colors, of course, makes a difference in the value as well. Now, let's get into some even more fine details. So beyond those things that are really pretty easy to see if you're paying attention, let's look at some things that are actually a little bit more difficult to take out. Now, I'm going to stay here on these prints because they make a good example of what I'm about to talk about, and that is the idea of fine block lines. If you look at the really fine black lines, like strands of hair, the bridge of the nose, how the mouth is done, the earlobe of the person, etc., etc., is it a clean, full, unbroken black line? If it's not, it's probably a later printing, meaning that the woodblock has been used to print quite a number of these, and so it's wearing down. And the things that wear off that woodblock first are those really fine lines, like the bridge of the nose. And so this is an example of pretty good fine block lines. But if you come over here to this one, like you take a look at this character's elbow, for example, you can see how all these block lines, and even what should be strong black lines in the sleeve of his kimono, it's not really very clear and stark black lines. So you can tell this was a print that was printed many times. It was probably pretty popular, and as such the key block lines are less strong. So that is a small detail that can determine, an earlier printing is going to be a stronger print and therefore be more valuable than a later printing that's not as clear and not as fine. Another fine detail that went into a lot of these prints is known as, I apologize, I've only ever read this term, I've never heard it said out loud, but gaufrage, I believe it's French. It's basically embossing in English. A lot of times in prints, there was embossing done, especially in the whites, and I'm going to use this example of the print with Takeda Shingen. And you can see not only gaufrage or embossing in the white of his helmet, but it's also visible in the red of his kimono, kind of his over manto, his cloak that he's wearing. And they did this really beautiful textured embossing as part of the print. And you find it very often in the whites, the collar, white collar of the kimono, etc. And if that gaufrage is really like full embossing, like it's really clean and clear and kind of strong, like you could actually even feel it if you ran your finger over it. Oftentimes you can feel that embossing or the gaufrage. So that's something else to look for. Finally, does the print have visible wood grain in the background? Again, if you are using a wood block, wood has grain, and that grain would often actually be visible in certain prints. Probably the most stark example I could give is this one of this leader of the 47 Ronin. In the background behind him in the blue, the dark night sky, you can make out this wood grain pattern, and that means it's probably a fairly early printing, and that wood grain is still starkly visible as a result of that. So again, just a small detail that can make a print seem worth more than the same print if it did not have that. Okay, so that's basically all I was planning on talking about in this video. Just some basic tips, certain things to look for when you're looking at a woodblock print, emphasizing the fact that you probably want to see it outside of the frame or outside of the case or whatever that it's in, because you're going to need to be able to see the back. You're going to want to check it against the light. You're going to want to be able to look into the fine details and check, is there that embossing? How good are the block lines? Basically, these are all things that you can use. Say if you're at a flea market or you're at an antique fair, you could use these things to perhaps bargain with the price if it's a place where you can bargain. You can take a look and say, well, look, the fine block lines are not all that great. Can you, this is not a very early printing. Can you lower the price a bit? Or, ooh, there's some foxing here and a little bit of wormage in the corner. Can you knock the price down for that, etc.? So these are things in your ammunition of saving money and adding to your collection without breaking the bank that you can use, because they're genuine things that affect condition, and condition, of course, affects price. So if you found this video useful, please be sure to hit the like button. Please subscribe for more content. If you love ukiyo-e, I will do ukiyo-e videos in the future. I don't do them every time because my channel is more about Japan in general, but it's a hobby of mine that I love, and I will certainly be doing a ukiyo-e video in the future. And I still have to do the video on the other half of my ukiyo-e collection. My first video where I talk about my collection, I only did about half of it, so I need to make the other half of that. So please look for that in the future as well. Thank you so very much for watching this particular video, and I will catch you next time. Peace.